Well, my goodness, what a week it has been. I don't know about you, but I just cannot believe some of these scenes that are coming out of Hawaii these days. Just an awful, awful tragedy of the wildfires out there that literally burned an entire town down. Just truly just awful, and no other way to describe it, what must be going on out there. At last count, I think over 100 people had lost their life in those fires. So, and it looks like that death count continues to grow. So our hearts and prayers and minds all go to the folks out there a long ways away, but I know it usually is a very popular tourist destination, and so I'm sure many of our listeners have been there or maybe know somebody who has. Just a terrible tragedy that is happening out there. If you want to help, I know we don't do this very often on the program. Obviously, one of the better organizations for disasters like this is the Red Cross. They've got a 1-800 number, 1-800-RED Cross, if you want to help with the tragedy that is unfolding out in Hawaii. My goodness, just absolutely terrible out there. Meanwhile, back here, the heat sort of continues, although it looks like we've gotten a minor reprieve. I mean, it has been incredibly hot, and everybody that I've been talking to has basically said, my goodness, this is like the hottest that we've seen, or like it feels the hottest summer that we've had for many years here in Central Florida. And as you know, Central Florida usually pretty hot summers, and so to feel that this one is different certainly gets your attention. My wife Stephanie actually went out for a walk last weekend and came back, and it was early in the morning. It wasn't the heat of the day in the afternoon, but came back just feeling really terrible. So we want to encourage folks to just be careful out there. She was felt terrible for the entire rest of the day. Wound up, I don't know if you've ever heard of this product, and this isn't necessarily a product push or certainly not a product placement, but Liquid IV, the little like pouches of this electrolyte solution that you can put into water. I usually have used those in the past for running, and of late this summer, after a run in the mornings, I've been using them because, the body is definitely a little off with how warm it is, even if you're going early in the morning. I think one morning this past week, I went at like 6 o'clock in the morning, and it was still very, very hot. Anyway, Liquid IV really did the trick. So encourage people to continue to make sure they stay hydrated, because otherwise bad things can happen and it can ruin the rest of your day. That stuff is available at like Amazon or your local Walgreens or Walmart. So it's used to be back in the day when I first discovered it, it wasn't as common, but certainly in the running world, it's quite popular, and so good product, and obviously did the trick with Stephanie and her probably mild heat stroke. Anyway, let's shift gears and obviously get started here on the program. We're going to talk about hard versus soft and what that means. What does that mean to you? Obviously, that can mean different things to different people. When we think about hard versus soft, some of the images that immediately come to mind are our bed, right? Or maybe our eggs or maybe our cheese, right? We all have preferences as whether we like our beds hard or soft, or maybe our eggs hard or soft. And not to get too much into a bed and breakfast kind of format for the program this morning, but more often than not, of late, you're hearing this hard versus soft discussion come up as it relates to the economy. So on the program, we're going to talk a little bit about what that all means. Obviously, that probably has a different connotation than having a hard bed or a soft bed, or ordering some hard eggs versus soft eggs. The reality is it's going to have some pretty significant investment implications if we're talking about it in terms of the economy. So we'll talk about what all of that means. And then we'll also talk about sometimes the hard feelings that can come up among families, especially when dealing with the passing of a loved one. And then after that, trying to divvy up all of their assets. And what's fascinating about this, and we've got a couple of stories that we're going to share with you later on in the program. What's fascinating about all this is it's funny. dividing up like the stocks or the mutual funds or the real estate, usually a pretty straightforward, non-emotional type of aspect to that. And that's oftentimes where sort of the bulk of the money is, the bulk of the real, kind of cash is. But where we see emotions really spike is actually more with like the personal property, like the stuff that's really probably not worth anything, a bunch of tchotchke, but it has sort of sentimental value. So we're going to talk about that and some of the things that you can do to sort of make your way through those difficulties or sort of navigate them. So when we think about the economy, we're going to think about that hard versus soft. And now it's getting described as sort of the landing, if you will, of where the economy is going to wind up. So which do you want, and what does that mean, and which one appears to be more likely? Well, if you think back to last year, it seemed like there was a growing consensus that it was going to be a hard landing. And as that name suggests, that was the expectation that there was going to be a recession. And now it seems like that you've got folks that are more in sort of that soft landing category where maybe we are going to be able to raise interest rates and get inflation under control without spiking up employment or slowing down consumer spending. So some interesting things happening, at least economically. And so understanding the difference between sort of that hard landing versus that soft landing can really make a big difference in how you address your underlying investments. Because here's the thing, if you think back to last year and so many folks were expecting a hard landing, well, if you had adjusted your portfolio accordingly, well, then you might have missed out on a lot of what was going on in the market so far this year. So we're going to spend some time sort of talking through that one and some of the things that you can do now to sort of prepare really either way. If right now consensus has shifted to, okay, maybe the economy is going to have a little bit of more of a soft landing, but as with anything, it's really hard to predict the future. So you probably want to position things appropriately no matter which way the economy goes, whether it winds up being a hard or a soft landing. So we'll get into much more detail on that, particularly some of the things that have sort of shifted this concept or the thought, if you will, that there was going to be a hard landing and now perhaps there might be more of a soft landing. So we'll talk about that as we continue here on the program. This course is Dollars and Cents. We want to welcome in all of our listeners on our various channels throughout Central Florida region. Also for our podcast platforms and YouTube channel as well. Hello to all of our listeners on those channels as well. If you want to make sure that you know when we upload new content, make sure you subscribe to us on your favorite platform of choice. Any trouble finding us, go to our website, nelsonfinancialplanning.com, and in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a bunch of different icons. Click on the one that looks most familiar to you, and you'll get instantly connected to the program. My name, of course, Joel Garris. I'm a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where we got a team of great people who also happen to be certified financial fiduciaries as well that stand ready to help you change your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. We're going to take a break. When we return, we're going to continue this conversation on some of the things that have happened in the economy and how we've shifted maybe from this hard to soft type of economic landing. Coming up next here on Dollars and Cents. So hard versus soft, what does that mean to you? And we're talking not necessarily about your bed or your eggs or your cheese, but the reality is that there's definitely a preference as to whether you have a hard economic landing or a soft economic landing, particularly when it comes to your investments and the shape of the economy. So hearing a lot about this hard versus soft landing in the media today, just to set the stage properly, as you might well imagine, a hard economic landing, as the name suggests, that would sound like, okay, that's probably not the one that I'm going to really want to root for here, right? Because if you hit something hard, usually you hurt yourself, right? So if you stub your toe hard, that's going to hurt. Versus if you just kind kind of just graze it, well, that's kind of softer and it doesn't hurt as much. The same kind of analogy applies to the economy as well. So a hard economic landing would be one where interest rates have gone up so much, so dramatically, that you start to see an impact in unemployment, meaning that the unemployment rate rises, consumer spending, as is often the case if you've got more people out of work, consumer spending then declines. That kind of formula always leads to sort of an economic decline. So that's sort of the hard landing proposition. The soft landing proposition, one that says, hey, maybe we can raise interest rates and for whatever reason, it doesn't quite increase unemployment as much as we might have been expecting. The consumer still continues to have its voracious appetite and continue to help drive the economy, maybe not as fast as what it might otherwise do in a pure sort of expansionary period of time, but one that is still growing and avoiding sort of more of that recessionary period of time. And so that gives you an idea of kind of this difference between hard landing versus soft landing. What's interesting is that if you think back to a year ago, I think pretty much every major media outlet was convinced that the hard landing was coming, right? You heard all this conversation of the recession's coming in 2022, mark the calendar, it'll be here. And then here we are, and it's August, so year's over, half over, and it hasn't really kind of shown up. So that kind of sort of whiplash, right? You go one direction and then you go the other. It's kind of like riding an amusement ride, right? Where you get jerked around left, right, and center, and the reality is that it makes it very hard to plan anything, right? Because you don't know what's going to happen. And I guess all of that really underscores the importance of some of the things that we talk about at length here on the program. And that's the notion of being diversified and being consistent, because you can't really predict the future, right? I think everybody was convinced, recession 2022, hard landing 2022, 2023, or they were thinking that in 2022 and thought that it was going to play out in 2023. And it really kind of hasn't. And that doesn't mean that it's not going to, because remember, recessions are a natural part of the economic cycle. But I think it underscores why it's so difficult to make those predictions and then think that you're going to be able to react inside of your investment portfolio for whatever you think is going to happen. Here's the reality, and because too often people try and predict what's going to happen, and all it takes is to sort of miss it just a little bit. So I want to give you this statistic, and we're going to kind of repeat it as well, just to make sure that we all understand it. So if you look at the past 15 years, and so we're in a period of time, you had COVID, you had a whole, U.S. downgrade in terms of its credit rating. All of that happened, multiple presidential elections, all of that stuff, right? And if you had invested $10,000 and just kind of looking at the performance of the S&P 500, so that sort of broad-based index, the 10,000, had you invested it 15 years ago, through all of those headlines, would have turned into about 35,000. Pretty good return, right? I mean, that's not bad. 3.5 times what you originally started with is always a good thing. But if you miss the best 10 days. Now stop and think about that. 15 years is about 250 trading days in a year. So 15 years times 250, that's about 9,500 different trading days. Did you know that all it takes is to miss just the 10 best days, out of that 9,500 day period of time, and all of a sudden the return that took you from 10,000 to 35,000 winds up dropping to being only about a third of that. The 10,000 turns into about 16,000. Let me say that one again. You missed 10 days. 10 days out of a 9,500 trading day or 15-year period, your return winds up being about a third of what it would be had you left it alone, been consistent, and remain diversified. That's pretty dramatic, right? I mean, granted, you may say, well, wait a minute, maybe I could miss the 10 worst days and then, miss and then be there for just the 10 best days. Couldn't I do that? Well, the reality is that we wish you well on that, because now you're trying to predict the future like every single day on a consistent basis. But the other twist to it, and here's the thing that I think people forget, because you hear so often people say, oh, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to get out of the market. I'm going to sit and I'm going to wait and then I'll see what happens. And the problem is that some of the very best days in the market are always clustered around the very worst days. And we've talked about this before on the program. The concept there is that volatility loves company. And so while you may say, well, I don't like the volatility when the market's going down, oftentimes volatility means that things are going down or up very rapidly in a short period of time. So that means then that some of the best days are always going to be clustered around some of those very worst days, making it really hard to predict which one or which day is going to be which. Good day, bad day, up day, down day. Hence the notion of staying as consistent as possible. Now, what's all happened, I guess, over the course of the past 12 months that has sort of changed the perspective? How do we go from hard to soft in terms of the economic picture? Well, we're going to talk about that and certainly get into much greater detail here as we continue on the program. But let me take a moment and welcome in our listening audience. Whether you're listening to us on the good old-fashioned radio or you're trying out this new technology called podcasts, we are available at any point in time. Obviously, the program comes to you live on Sunday mornings on a variety of Central Florida radio stations. Dollars and Cents can also be found on a variety of podcast platforms as well. So along with our YouTube channel at Nelson Financial Planning, go ahead and subscribe to us once you find our channel. If you have any trouble finding said channel, make sure you go ahead and head over on to our website, nelsonfinancialplanning.com, and then you will be able to see the various icons. Click on the one that looks most familiar to you, and you'll get directly connected over to our program on that particular platform. Averaging over 1,000 downloads a month these days on our program. So we want to thank all of our listeners on the podcast platforms that they catch us on. My name, of course, is Joel Garris. I'm a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary of Nelson Financial Planning, where we got a team of great folks that ultimately stand ready to help you change your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. So why the change? How do we get from hard to soft? How do we go from this notion of, oh, there's going to be a recession happening in 2023 to now it's August and the market's not exactly behaving like there's a recession happening. In fact, the markets have had a pretty strong year so far. Well, I think it breaks down into sort of three different areas. And the first area has to deal with the fact that everybody was sort of expecting a recession this year. So if you're a business or if you're a consumer, chances are that you probably took some steps to kind of clean things up. Maybe that, from a business perspective, maybe that meant that you were refinancing your debt and ultimately getting a much lower fixed rate on your corporate debt. Certainly a lot of consumers did that. We had someone come into the office just this past week that was talking about their 30-year fixed rate mortgage that they happened to get when they bought a property a couple of years ago, and it was 2.75%. Stop and think about that. That's an incredibly low rate. And then, of course, you've got inflation, which is sort of moderated somewhat, although prices of the gas at the pump is certainly going up. And then consumer spending continuing to be relatively strong. Bottom line, these are the things that can quickly change, which is why we do this program each and every week, to help give perspective on what's happening in today's world. With that, we'll take a break and continue after these messages here on Dollars and Cents. Speaking of soft versus hard, and we've been sort of working with that theme during the course of the program, one of the things that I think we can all agree on, we may debate whether we like a soft bet or a hard bet or how we would like our eggs, but what I think one of the things that we can all agree on is that we don't like hard feelings among our family, right? I mean, and I get it. Okay, every family is different. Every family is unique. Every family has its struggles. But when you put the combination of the passing of a loved one and money or what to do with it or assets or property, you put that together and you can get some pretty hard feelings pretty quickly. A lot of those sort of issues that were sort of lurking in the background really come to the forefront and are laid raw when you're dealing with such a highly emotional type of circumstance. And you know, it's funny, and we've certainly worked, we've been executor and trustee on just countless estates over the course of the past 25 years. And what's unique is that it often comes down to more of the personal property that is the sort of the real fight or the real struggle. It's easy to divide up an investment account. It's easy to divide up a bunch of mutual funds or stocks or whatever the case may be. It's even easy to kind of divide up real estate, right? I mean, you get an appraisal and then that's the number, and then, you know, you do the math and okay, we're going to split it out. But where it really gets a little bit more raw emotional is on the personal property side of things. And you would think that it doesn't happen there, but we find that it does. And when we talk about personal property, we're talking about things that you can physically possess. So think about silverware or china or jewelry, or maybe it's a desk or a piece of furniture, or maybe it's something from the holidays that was a fixture at many a Thanksgiving dinner or a Christmas dinner where every year mom served the turkey on the big platter that had the pretty little corn husks on it and the pilgrims and all those kinds of things. And so what we find is that it's these items of personal property that sometimes can really create a tremendous amount of strife and hard feelings among the family as people go through that. And certainly we've seen some pretty tragic circumstances of that in terms of how that plays out. I think we've certainly shared on the program before, but I was involved in one situation where we were the trustee and the executor trying to sort of work through, you know, just really some last few items of personal property. I think at the end of the day, there was like 18 items, right? So it was a whole house full of stuff. And it really kind of boiled down to like these 18 items what the three different beneficiaries ultimately wanted, but they couldn't agree. And it really got very dramatic when, you know, we're on site at the house and sort of going through this stuff and pulling aside all these different, you know, various 18 items. And one of the beneficiaries wound up kind of waving a handgun around just to kind of show that, hey, I've got a gun and we're not gonna, you know, take it if this doesn't go well or any of that. And by the way, as a trustee or executive, that's a lot more than what I bargained for. But it just really, I think, is a story that really can underscore how dramatically emotional people can become, because the whole conversation about what was over stuff that at the end of the day really didn't have any real value. No monetary value, but it had that emotional value. It had the memories associated with it. The writing desk, which was one of the 18 items, was you know, memories of Dad paying bills using that desk for years and years and years. And then there was the nativity scene that they put out at the holidays. I mean, it really monetarily did not have any value, but boy, it really had a lot of emotional content to it, because so often I think when we think about those items of personal property, we think about the memories that are associated with that, and we group those together much more strongly, I think, than like owning a stock or a mutual fund or something like that. So, and the tricky part of personal property is that it often gets overlooked, right? We talk to clients all the time about, make sure you got beneficiaries on your investment accounts. Make sure you're using a ladybird deed on a piece of property. But the stuff that is personal property, you can't really put a name on it, right? I mean, you can't take your coffee mug and, kind of say, this goes to, little Johnny. I mean, granted, you can have a monogram coffee mug, but I mean, you can't really have it as a titling of the coffee mug. And so far too often that stuff gets overlooked. And so we've got a lot of things that we want people to be thinking about now to really try and avoid this. So we've got a list of 3 or 4 items to really kind of be thinking about as we think about these items of personal property. So welcome on into the program. This, of course, is Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. One of Central Florida's longest running radio program, also one of the top 25 financial planning podcasts on the World Wide Web. My name is Joel Garris, certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where we got a team of great folks. Matter of fact, next week we're going to be joined by one of those folks, Christina Lamb, talking a little bit about some energy credits because it's really hot out there. She may want to think about ways that I could maybe save on my utility bill. So she'll be joining us next week. But during the week, obviously, the entire team, myself included, stands ready to help you change your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. So what are the things that you can really be thinking about to help avoid these issues that we've seen come up when it involves personal property? Well, first of all, it starts with naming the right personal representative or executor under your will. That's the person that's going to have to make the decision involving personal property. Because remember, personal property, you can't title it. Personal property goes through the will to whoever has been named in that document. And the reality is you want to make sure that your executor, your personal representative, is somebody that isn't necessarily completely black and white, because in terms of how they think, because they really are going to perhaps have to be creative, particularly when it comes to these decisions involving personal property. They got to be able to think out of the box, especially if folks start fighting over, a nativity scene or writing desk or, that Thanksgiving platter. Another thing you can do beyond kind of naming the right person is to make sure that you spell it out in your will. See, most wills reference a personal property memorandum that you can sign and date. It's not part of the will. It's a separate document. The reason it's a separate document is it avoids the notion of, I got to go see the lawyer to change the will because the Thanksgiving platter actually, last Thanksgiving, it fell on the floor and cracked into a million pieces, so I threw it away. So it's no longer something that Susie's going to get. It's going to have to be something else, and I need to go see the lawyer. The point of a personal property memorandum that you can just simply sign and date that becomes part of the will is to be able to do that and do that more easily as things, particularly personal property items, change on a regular basis. And then I would certainly look at specifying a distribution method. Maybe that's specifying lottery. Maybe that's specifying drawing cards. Maybe that's specifying drawing numbers and then staying in that numbered sequence in such a way so that everybody feels like they're getting an equal opportunity to make a selection of whatever the personal property item is. And then lastly, make sure, to the extent that there's any heirlooms involved, make sure you get those appraised, because that's part of figuring out the equitable distribution of the personal property. If there's a valuable desk or a valuable piece of tchotchke or a valuable piece of artwork, if you got a number, if you got an appraisal, then that becomes a number, and then that way you can kind of make sure that things are getting equitably distributed. Combined with the fact that if you do decide to donate anything, having that appraisal is going to be necessary to make sure that you're able to justify the tax deduction with the IRS. Bottom line, folks, on this, take the time to talk about it. Take the time to write it down. Don't assume. The name of the game is you want to avoid those hard feelings among your loved ones. And unfortunately, it often comes up in an area where you wouldn't kind of think that it might, involving personal property when someone passes. We're going to take a break and continue after these messages here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. So last segment of the program, I want to take a moment and just pause and certainly take a minute and recognize just the tragic turn of events that's happened out there in Hawaii with the wildfires. Last count, well over 100 people have passed. as we said at the beginning of the program, we don't normally do this, but if you do want to help, there are options for that. Great organizations that have been around a long time, most obvious of which is sort of the Red Cross. They've got a 1-800 Red Cross number. It actually says 1-800 Red Cross, and that you can dial if you want to help and contribute to the cause out there, because certainly terribly tragic in terms of what's going on out there. Closer to home, the heat has just been unbelievable. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself. Stay hydrated. Okay, we talked about at the beginning of the program, my wife Stephanie went on a walk and came back and wasn't feeling good for the rest of the day. So make sure that you take a moment to stay hydrated beyond just kind of water. Some of these products out there, we mentioned Liquid IV earlier in the program, great ways to kind of really kind of get those electrolytes back into your system, because one of those things that can happen if you get too dehydrated, and I've had it actually happen with my elderly mother, and that means that if you get too dehydrated, you wind up having to go to the hospital, which is not really where anybody wants to do. So make sure you're taking care of yourself out there, particularly here in Central Florida, where it is just really hot. Speaking of really hot, of course, that also means that your energy bill is probably going up. So next week on the program, we're going to be joined by fellow certified financial fiduciary Christina Lamb, also happens to be an IRS enrolled agent, and we're going to be talking about some of these energy credits that are available out there and how you can make sure that you're able to maximize those credits on your tax return as much as possible, and hopefully save some money on that power bill. So that's what's coming up on the program next week. This week's program, we certainly talked about sort of this notion of hard versus soft, particularly as it relates to the economy. Right now, or at least last year, everybody was talking about a hard landing, which doesn't appear, at least right now, to have happened. It's really more of a soft landing. Hard landing is one where unemployment jumps up, consumer spending goes down, and as you might well imagine, if you've ever been stubbed your toe hard, you know that that's a little bit more painful than if you do that, and it's only sort of a soft stub, if you will. So ultimately, a lot of reasons why I think that has happened. The reality is that in the expectation of an impending recession, both businesses and consumers sort of cleaned up their financial picture. A lot of people refinanced into debt, and that those interest rates much lower, and more importantly, fixed rates on that, and which obviously puts people in better economic shape. Along with moderating inflation, certainly the issues with the supply chains have somewhat disappeared, right? Remember last year when everybody was running around, or a year and a half ago when everybody was running around, hoarding toilet paper, and the car lots were empty because you couldn't get the chips for the cars in order to get them out of the manufacturing plants and to the dealerships. So a lot of that has abated somewhat, but too often we try and predict the future, and then we make adjustments to our portfolio when we try to predict the future. And as we shared with you earlier in the program, that's kind of a really bad idea, right? If you think of just being consistent and being diversified, the example we gave, just putting $10,000 15 years ago in the market as measured by the S&P 500, $10,000 turns into $35,000 over the course of that 15-year period of time. You missed the 10 best days, so that's not a lot out of almost a 9,500 trading day period. That return only winds up being about a third. So you lose basically almost 2/3 of the return by simply missing the 10 best days during that entire 15-year period of time. That to us really underscores the reason of why don't get caught up in whether someone's predicting a hard landing or a soft landing or what's going to happen next year in terms of the economy. Ultimately, it comes back to being diversified and being consistent and making sure that your investment allocation is where it needs to be. Every investment allocation should have some portion that's stocks, bonds, and cash. Cash being the emergency savings, money market, savings account, whatever the case may be. Bonds, meaning the range of bonds, whether they're corporate bonds or government bonds. And then, of course, stocks Obviously, we like to recommend folks to bend more towards larger companies because they have a tendency to be a little bit more stable than, say, smaller companies. But if you have a diversified portfolio like that, then you've got different things in it, right? And different things are going to be performing differently at different times. When the stock market maybe isn't behaving as well, then, cash is still cash. And so if you've got using an investment portfolio to generate out income, then you can easily shift over to, I'm going to use some of my cash to generate my monthly income and let the stock side of my portfolio recover. So that's sort of the strategy that we would recommend folks to use to sort of navigate through all of this, because at the end of the day, nobody can predict the future, that's for sure. And it's so important to be consistent, even though sometimes that sounds easy to do, but in reality, it's really hard. And it's frustrating for sure when you listen to the media and how much it just whipsaws back and forth. One day it's this, one day it's that. One announcer says this, one announcer says that. The reality is that it's highly speculative when you're trying to predict what's going to happen tomorrow. But one of the things that we can predict is that if you do not take the time to plan ahead and write it down and talk it through as a family, there will be a high likelihood of hard feelings among your family members after you pass, unless you take the time to do it right. Remember, if you're putting sticky notes on a bunch of items of personal property, a sticky note isn't a legal document. And sticky notes, they stick, but oftentimes they don't stick. And so, right? Haven't we all encountered that? Because sometimes you put a sticky note and then you're like, where'd the sticky note go? And it's not there anymore because it got unstuck. Sticky notes are not legal documents. So what you want to do as it relates to items of personal property is to make sure that you're taking the time to include that personal property memorandum as part of your overall estate planning. That document, that personal property memorandum, becomes part of the will. You date it, you sign it, and that lists who's getting what as it relates to personal property. Also, some of the other suggestions that we made earlier in the program, you want to make sure you select the right personal representative, the right executor, to kind of go through this process as calmly and as balanced as possible. Maybe even specify a distribution method of choice for those items that you haven't specifically named people to receive, and then get those heirlooms appraised. To the extent you got some valuable stuff, make sure you get it appraised. Bottom line, take the time to write it down and discuss it with your family. So important, right, to have some perspective and advice on these kinds of range of issues. If you have questions about anything we talked about on the program, give us a call to set up a free conversation, or reach out to us on our website at Nelson Financial Planning, here to answer questions about anything that we may have talked about on the program, or if you've got something that you'd like us to talk about on the program at a future date. We're open to suggestions on topics. With that, we will wrap it on up and get on out of here. If you liked what you heard and want to learn more about us as an organization, schedule a free conversation with us at any time in the course of the next week. With that, we're going to get on out of here. This has been Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning here on Dollars and Cents.